What's up, everybody? Welcome to Believe in White Sox. The World Series starts tonight, and while there really isn't a whole lot of White Sox news, I wanted to make sure that we stay fresh and we stay nimble in terms of what we are doing right now. And what I want to say in this episode is not necessarily about the White Sox, but it's about the four teams that were in the AL and NL championship series. And the reason why I want to talk about those teams is because those organizations have, in many ways, set the model for what competitive teams, World Series teams, are nowadays. And let's call a spade a spade. Until the Ishbias get control of the White Sox, which is not going to be anytime soon, they're never going to spend like the Dodgers. But what I will say is this. You can win by spending a little bit more, but also having an emphasis on development. And that's what the Milwaukee Brewers have done with their bullpen. That's what the Seattle Mariners have done with their starting rotation, and to an extent, with their lineup. You know, the Mariners are a team that signed Julio Rodriguez and developed him. They drafted Cal Raleigh, and he turned into the best offensive catcher that the franchise has had, and had probably the best season that a catcher has had offensively in Major League Baseball history. The Toronto Blue Jays are a little bit different because they have spent more than the Brewers or the Mariners. Significantly more than the Brewers, slightly more than the Mariners. But what the Blue Jays have done is they have mixed together development and proper free agent signings. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, they developed guys like Bo Bichette and Vlad Guerrero Jr. Now, Vlad Guerrero Jr. is somebody that is making a lot of money now. And he is warranted that money because Vladimir Guerrero Jr. is one of the best power hitters in all of baseball. And the home run numbers may not necessarily tell it, but he has got as good gap-to-gap power as anybody in the league. And relative to what he had done in years past, his numbers were down. But he's the example of what development, because you knew he was going to be good, but you didn't know how good he was going to be when he was coming up through the minor leagues. Now you look at him as somebody that, made his big league debut at age 20, is only 26 years old now, and is approaching 200 career homers. He's the example of what you can be if you develop properly. The Brewers have had the super bullpen, and the super bullpen is, guys like McGill and Uribe and other guys that you didn't necessarily draft but picked up off the scrap heap. Like, I remember working in an independent league with one of their relievers, Jared Koenig. Finding rookies and developing them. Finding guys like Quinn Priester off the scrap heap and having him be a guy that turns into a reliable starter. You look up and down the Brewers rotation and you just say at first glance, who do I recognize here? Well, there's a lot of guys that you're like, huh? And then you take your high-level prospects like Jacob Mizorowski, who was a second-rounder, and you turn him into one of the biggest weapons that you have. And the Brewers have also done great around the margins, like the Andrew Vaughn acquisition. I mean, that to me is picking up somebody that was no longer valued by one organization and is now valued by another organization. Caleb Durbin, who they got in the Devin Williams trade. That guy is a critical piece to their infield. These are not guys that they're paying a lot of money. Isaac Collins, Sal Frelick, Blake Perkins. And then you have your studs in Christian Yelich, who is really the only high-priced guy that they have in terms of a veteran acquisition. And then they bought the futures on Jackson Chourio. And I think that, injuries aside, this last postseason is going to work out really, really well. You look at the Seattle Mariners. Logan Gilbert, you drafted. Brian Wu, you drafted. George Kirby, you drafted. Luis Castillo was an acquisition, but still a big part of developing a rotation. Other guys that they've drafted, like the Emerson Hancocks of the world, the Bryce Millers of the world. These are guys that they have either traded for as minor leaguers and developed or developed organically. The Mariners have done as good of a job as anybody in baseball at developing pitching. So have the Brewers. But then what the Mariners did is they saw weak spots in their lineup, and they shored those up by reacquiring Eugenio Suarez and picking up Josh Naylor. The Mariners are the perfect example of the team that will spend enough to be competitive but isn't necessarily going to try and win by spending. They tried that in the previous era of their organization with Jack Zarenzik as their president of baseball operations, and that didn't necessarily work. You got a lot of high-priced contracts and not a lot of wins. All I'm saying is that there's a lot here that you can model what you want to be if you are the Chicago White Sox. But it all stems from being able to develop in the minor leagues. And you just look at the bullpen. Like, every team in this postseason, save for, say, the Dodgers, and they signed Roki Sasaki to be a starter. They didn't sign him to be a closer. And he will be a starter next year because Clayton Kershaw is retiring. And they put too much money into somebody like him to have him be a bullpen guy. They did. They put too much money into him to be a bullpen guy. So Roki Sasaki is going to be in your rotation. So the Dodger bullpen has not been a factor because their starting pitching has been so good. Now, most years, the Dodger bullpen has been very good. This year, it hasn't. So, the Dodgers aren't necessarily a team that wins around the margins, but they have in the past. Two guys in particular that I think of, one of them that's still on the team, two of them actually are still on the team. Your Chris Taylors, your Kike Hernandez's, and your Max Muncy's of the world, guys that have been long-time productive players of your lineup that were cast off by other organizations. Kike Hernandez was an unthought-of sixth-round pick by the Astros in 2009. He bounced around before he made his way to the Dodgers, and, he is the type of guy that is, quite frankly, not really going to succeed in other places. He's not. He made his debut with the Astros. He was picked up by the Marlins, and, the Dodgers somehow find him, develop him, and he's been one of the more productive utility men in baseball for a long period of time. All this is, in this quick little 10-minute episode, all this is to say is that you look at the common thread of the teams that win, and it's development and depth of pitching, especially in the bullpen. Development of position players that you can sign to long-term contracts. Development of young position players. And that's where we're going to need to see jumps next year from Mydroth, from Montgomery, from Vargas, from Sosa. And then will we see Braden Montgomery make a debut? Will we see Kyle Teal play the outfield? Will him working on being an outfielder be a part of his further development? Will Edgar Caro develop more power? Will the White Sox be able to develop one of these, quote-unquote, and a lot of it stems from being able to take starting pitching depth and turn it into bullpen depth. The more I've thought about it, the more that it does not make sense for Grant Taylor to stay in the bullpen. The rotation right now is not deep enough. You do not have enough rotation depth for him to be strictly a bullpen guy, and you did not draft him to be a bullpen guy. You brought him up to ease his innings in coming off a surgery. So what does your bullpen look like if it becomes a great bullpen down the line? And I don't see anybody on this team that can be part of that. As much as I criticize Jordan Leisure, he might be the one guy to where if they can develop him further, maybe he becomes one of those lights-out relievers. I still think the White Sox need to give Mike Vassell a chance to make a starting rotation spot next year. But, you look at the guys that I think are a part of this team beyond next year. It's Mike Vassell, Grant Taylor, Shane Smith, Davis Martin, I'll say it, Jordan Leisure, Wickelman Gonzalez, and then Sean Burke to an extent. I think you have to see what Kai Busch looks like when he comes back. Maybe he's somebody that becomes a long-term bullpen guy. Maybe he's not the guy that you thought he was going to be, and maybe he ends up being your hard-throwing left-handed closer. Maybe Drew Thorpe, when he comes back, he becomes a down-and-dirty change-up guy in the 7th or 8th inning, or somebody that can give you 2 innings in a pinch. But there has to be more development of your current assets to give you depth. Because right now you don't have depth. And in baseball, if you don't have depth, I don't think you have sustained success. The White Sox have good pieces and spots. But the reason why you've lost 100 games 3 years in a row, although this year being different than the prior 2 years, is that you do not have depth in positions you need to have depth. And so I'm hoping that the White Sox can evaluate the current playoffs and be able to have some sort of self-awareness in terms of what do we have to do to get ourselves to this point. And it's not going to be spending all of the money. I don't think that's not, in my opinion, that's not the right way to go about it. Spending all of the money is not going to work. What's going to work is drafting and developing. And with that, we bid you adieu. Happy World Series, everybody. We'll talk to you more when there's news.